I have continued to receive mirth moments from members of the congregation. Some of them may feel slightly guilty for what they've submitted, but I promise not to say anything. Here's a wonderful one. A pastor decided to conduct a visual demonstration that would add emphasis to his Sunday sermon. So 4 worms were placed into 4 separate jars. The first worm was put into a container of alcohol. The second worm was put into a container of cigarette smoke. The third worm was put into a container of chocolate syrup. The fourth worm was put into a container of clean, good soil. At the conclusion of the sermon, which you can imagine was all about the naughty things some people do and shouldn't, at the conclusion of the sermon, the minister reported the results of this experiment. The first worm in alcohol, dead. The second worm in cigarette smoke, dead. The third worm in chocolate syrup, dead. The fourth worm in good, clean soil, alive. And so the pastor asked the congregation, "Now, friends, what did you learn from this demonstration?" Now, Maxine was sitting in the back there, and she quickly raised her hand. She said, "Pastor, as long as you drink, smoke, and eat chocolate cake, you ain't gonna have no worms." So there is a certain logic to that response. That's just one more, because I've asked people for puns. This was a huge mistake, I now concede, but I'm getting these puns and I share the best of them, yeah. The quiet of the neighborhood's early evening hours was punctuated by a terrible noise erupting from one of the houses. The neighbors, being greatly concerned, called the police, who arrived shortly on the scene. Upon entering the home, they discovered the home's inhabitant on the floor of his study, covered by an avalanche of books. After a lengthy investigation, the police determined there was no foul play. Wait for it. They decided that the hapless fellow, I hate to do this to you, had only his shelf to blame. Well, if you can do better. Well, I want to share some ideas this morning about guilt. And you may say, why? Because guilt is often a very pervasive part of our own psychologies. It's sometimes driven into us in our early years. And as Shakespeare once remarked, all the assaults of nature are not so cruel and painful as is guilt. Guilt can be a deeply corrosive acid in our hearts and minds, in perhaps even our souls. So what about this business of guilt, this guilt trip? Okay, all right. How did I first encounter guilt myself? Well, I encountered it under a very unpleasant circumstance which was prolonged for some years. And it had to do with growing up and being educated, as Dickens would have said, by hand. Mrs. Fillmore, who was the co-founder of the Unity Movement, she was incidentally one of the first women graduates in America. I don't know whether you knew that. She went to Oberlin College. I believe we have an alumna of that college in our midst. Oberlin College, Ohio. I think it was founded about 1833. She was one of the first women graduates in this country. And she founded a little magazine called We Wisdom. And some of you may remember it. I wish to take credit here for one moment. When I was sitting on the board of directors of Unity School of Christianity many years ago, it was decided to close We Wisdom. It really wasn't making much money, I have to be honest. It was really being subsidized. and I persuaded the board to keep it on for a few more years. So I do take some credit for that. But Mrs. Fillmore, as she wrote later, she started that magazine in part because she didn't want to see children whom she loved grow up feeling guilty, constantly guilty for things that they had never done and couldn't even contemplate. She was wanting to free youngsters to explore the wonder and mystery of their own minds without being restrained or constrained in this unfortunate way. So I've always been grateful to her for having placed that notion at the heart of our own movement. But going back to my early days, early days, I was placed in a boys' academy. My parents loved me very much indeed. There was no punitive aim involved, and I was not, I think, a bad child. But I started in when I was very young, the age of about 6, and it was a boys' school, as I say, and all the teachers were masters. We called them masters. And the predominant opinion in that school amongst the teaching staff was that all little boys were de facto guilty. Some truth in that assertion, possibly. But we had this drummed into us, not only drummed, but otherwise inculcated. We were always guilty. In fact, we were asked after the commission of some imagined offense, guilty or not guilty. There was only one answer. If you said, not guilty, a storm of retribution fell upon you. The best you could expect was a clip round the ear, and far worse to follow. So guilty, guilty, guilty. It's amusing, I've always thought, that under common law we allow our supposed criminals the privilege of pleading innocent before they are found guilty. Now, in some parts of the world, under different legal systems, notably the Code Napoleon or the Roman law legal system, the presumption is of guilt until innocence is proved. And it's always struck me as rather ironic that the one person in that school who thought us innocent until proven guilty was the French teacher, who was a woman, a native of France, which presumes guilt before innocence is proven. How could she look upon us as innocent while the rest of the teaching staff indubitably condemned us as guilty? Well, that was my first major encounter with guilt and the need to acknowledge guilt. I didn't know what for. I was quite a good child, believe it or not. Extraordinary, isn't it? I can't remember any major transgressions as I look back. In fact, I would say I was virtually an innocent. Not entirely, perhaps, but certainly I didn't feel the level of guilt that I was being taught I ought to experience and merit condign punishment for it. It's a lovely word, condign. It means well merited. And I couldn't get this through my head. Now, that happened, I think, to many of us of a certain generation, that those around us considered us guilty by virtue of our very existence. And I could never really figure out why that was so. It seemed unjust. Now, many of us had this notion confirmed when we went to church, because we were told over and over again from the pulpit, ye have sinned and you are guilty. Now, I was very lucky in one regard. I didn't grow up in a conventionally churched situation. My father never went to church. He was a wonderful man, one of the most remarkable and kindly men I've ever known. Didn't go to church. I've never known him. I never knew him to go to church. My mother was a natural sensitive or psychic, and she didn't go to church because she had her own sense of belief. Amazingly enough, the Episcopal Church, to which she nominally belonged, actually allowed her to conduct spiritual healing services in their sanctuaries, provided a priest stood behind her. But she was allowed even to do this, and she was well thought of. But I had no sense of religiously induced guilt when I was growing up. And when I was about 15 or 16, I went to a pastor because, frankly, I needed him to sign a document that was beneficial to me at that time. And he said, well, have you acknowledged your guilt? And I said, guilt for what? And that was the wrong thing to say. I didn't get my document signed, of course. But he did embark upon what I could only describe as an excursus, a lengthy digression on why I ought to feel guilty. And I tried later on, when I began to study religion, theology, philosophy, to get this whole notion of guilt in perspective. Well, of course, it's part of a wonderfully elegant and historically developed notion which has Jesus at its center. When Jesus died as he did, it seemed that that death was meaningless almost, without purpose to many of his followers. But the early fathers, and they were fathers, the early fathers of the church constructed this huge system which involved people in a garden doing something naughty a long time ago. I remember there was an apple and a snake, and those two items seemed relatively innocent to me. But of course their sin was the sin of self-knowledge, and the ancients needed to explain that. But that was fed into this system, this wonderfully elegant system. We sinned in the garden, therefore we were guilty of original sin. You couldn't wash this clean. You couldn't say, no, I didn't do it. Not guilty. You couldn't, because you were guilty. That was it. But you could seek redemption through accepting Jesus and his teachings, and through that redemption might eventually come salvation, provided that you were able to follow the doctrines and the dogmas of the church as they were laid down. Again, this always seemed to me to be the most extraordinary kind of assertion. I didn't know why I should be guilty of something that occurred so long ago that it was lost in the aeons of time. And of course, today we recognize that it's a creation myth. Doesn't mean it's not true if you want to believe it as real, but it's so lost in time and so surrounded by legend that, of course, one can never know. But the whole elegant theology of salvation required that we be guilty. How could we be saved if we weren't guilty? We must be guilty of something. Well, Jesus, when I looked in the Bible, doesn't seem to talk about guilt very much. In fact, he doesn't mention it at all. But there is this lovely passage in John where Jesus says to the woman who has been taken in transgression of the law, Jesus said to the woman, has no one condemned you yet? And she said, no one. And Jesus said, neither do I condemn you. Go your way. Don't transgress, but go your way. There's no hint there of any kind of original guilt or even original sin. Somebody made a mistake for which they might well need to feel guilty, but there was no condemnation in Jesus. And there was no condemnation in Jesus in that regard. So one has to ask oneself, why in our culture has the notion of guilt become so firmly established? Does this mean that we can do away with it altogether? I don't think so. There are things that people do for which they should feel guilty. I don't doubt that. I don't doubt that. What I'm saying is that we shouldn't be so mired in this guilt complex that is part of our cultural heritage that we can't seem to make a distinction between generalized feelings of guilt and specific issues for which we might very well feel guilty. Guilt, believe it or not, if we experience it in the right way, can be a freeing emotion that helps us to grow and to transform our lives. If we have done something wrong to somebody, and some of us in this room may have done so, something egregiously wrong, I don't know. So if you're feeling guilt, that's a plus factor. You know you've done something that is not worthy of your stature as a child of God. You know that you could have done much, much better in that circumstance, not reacted with rage, frustration, bitterness, even violence. And so you feel guilty. It's a form of regret, but a bitter form of regret. But so soon as one begins to repent for having committed that kind of act, then guilt assumes a positive dimension in consciousness. It's a way of moving forward, of lifting us to a higher level of understanding. I know I did wrong in this situation. I'm sorry, forgive me. Guilt can form a very positive part of our forward spiritual movement and development. I have seen people who have taken guilt, not the universalized guilt that the church has laid upon generations, not the kind of guilt that was beaten into us at school. I have seen people taken guilt in a constructive way and use it to change their lives and the lives of others. I knew, for example, many, many years ago, a pilot who was in the 8th Air Force. This was the Air Force that bombed Germany during the war. Terrible suffering resulted to the civilian population, most of whom obviously were entirely innocent of any crime whatsoever. But as he pointed out, when you're dropping bombs from 30,000 feet, you don't think about the individual impact below. After the war, he began to feel guilty for having done this. Not guilty for having necessarily used bombs to free people from tyranny, which is an argument one can make. He felt guilty about the pain and suffering he had unintentionally inflicted upon people who obviously didn't deserve it. And so for the remainder of his life, and he lived until quite recently, he would go back to Germany every year and work with, initially with the survivors, and then with the children, then with the grandchildren of survivors of those terrible, terrible bomb attacks that he had helped to deliver during the war. He transmuted his guilt into something positive. It became for him a positive experience, and for those he served. He brought good into this world, undoubtedly. And there are ways in which guilt can function in this manner. I've met people who felt guilty. I knew a young man who felt guilty for years and years and years because his dad was an athlete and he could never measure up to that man's wishes and requirements for him. He felt guilty that he had failed as the perfect son. What a tragedy that somebody should feel guilt for that kind of endeavor that he had failed to accomplish successfully. He became a very, very effective teacher of young people. He didn't go near athletics because that was not his chosen field. He discovered that he had a certain genius in math. But he spent his time working with young people who had been similarly affected by that kind of negative experience. The guilt accumulated from failing to measure up to somebody else's agenda for us. Why is it we often feel guilty? Because we haven't met somebody else's agenda. We set cruel enough agendas for ourselves, folks, without looking around for other people to set them. We are very good at beating up on ourselves, and especially if we have something of the guilt complex. Now, I don't know. Some of you may feel offended that I'm dismissing the labyrinthine theology of the church when I say that it's a deliberately contrived structure which is designed not only to bring us into conformity with dogma, with doctrine, but also designed for those who promulgate this doctrine to in some way control us. We are freer than that, folks. I think most of us sitting in this room have something called a conscience. I think we know instinctively, especially if we are on the spiritual path, the spiritual road. We know instinctively when we've done something unkind or wrong. We know it. We're not fools. Morally, most of us have a clear understanding. And we may feel guilty for that, justifiably so. We've hurt somebody, we've done something foolish, we've done something destructive. Surely the guilt factor does come into that. Not from some cosmic, distant force, not from some educational fantasy that drove people who brought us up to consider us inherently guilty of something. This comes out of our own heart searching. And if that is the case, if we do feel guilty for something, for some transgression, we don't even have to admit it to anybody. We can say, I am going to work on this because I feel a genuine sense of repentance. I feel that I should work my way through this. It may be too late to apologize to the person whom we actually wronged. They may be gone themselves from this planet. But at least that purging experience helps to lift us into a new consciousness, a new awareness of what Spirit wants for us. The constructive, the positive, the joyous, the loving, the accepting. The very nature that we strive to emulate. It helps us. So let's not, as George Bernard Shaw said, throw the baby out with the bathwater. He did say that. We don't have to say guilt serves no role at all. Yes, I believe guilt has a role or function to play in the development of our spiritual lives, if it helps us to grow in understanding and in compassion and in love and acceptance. If it helps to change us into better people. I don't think the institutionalized guilt from which many of us suffered and from which many of us really have sometimes never been able to recover, I don't think that's at all a positive aspect of being. So I invite you to consider guilt in a different light. Now, I'm only sharing ideas with you this morning. You make up your own minds, you think about it, you come to your own conclusions. But let's look at guilt in a new way and throw out the guilt that has no meaning in our lives. And if we must at all experience that unhappy state of mind, let it then at least be for some positive purpose to help us in our spiritual growth. Now, of course, I should sit down and shut up, but wait. This church in a few minutes is going to provide you with an opportunity to assuage the guilt that some of you must have experienced last Sunday when you watched that sad Seahawks game. So now is your chance. It's your decision, but it'll make you feel so good to do this, and I leave it in your hands, and I really do sit down and shut up now.